Behind the glory and grandeur of ancient Egypt, their way of life was filled with customs so bizarre that they seem almost unreal today. For most of us, the idea of marrying a sibling sounds unthinkable. But in ancient Egypt, this was not only normal, it was expected, especially for the royal family. Pharaohs believed they were not just rulers, but living gods on earth. Their status had to be preserved at all costs, and they saw one way to do this: keeping the bloodline pure. To prevent outsiders from marrying into the royal family, pharaohs often married their own sisters, half-sisters, and sometimes even daughters. This practice wasn't a one-time event or a rare exception. It happened for centuries and involved some of the most famous names in Egyptian history. One of the most well-known cases was King Tutankhamun. He married his half-sister Ankhesenamun to maintain the royal bloodline, but the effects of this inbreeding were disastrous. Modern scientists who studied King Tut's mummy found that he suffered from multiple health problems, including a clubfoot, cleft palate, and a severely weakened immune system. His parents were also siblings, which likely led to the genetic issues that made him physically fragile and contributed to his early death at just 19 years old. It wasn't just about power, it was about religion. Pharaohs were considered the earthly form of the god Horus, and their rule was seen as divinely ordained. Marrying an outsider was seen as polluting this divine bloodline. To them, a brother and sister who shared the same royal blood were the best possible match. Even the pharaohs they worshipped followed this practice. The most important divine couple in Egyptian mythology, Osiris and Isis, were siblings who married each other. By following their god's example, the pharaohs believed they were fulfilling their sacred duty. One of the most extreme examples of royal incest was Cleopatra VII, Egypt's most famous queen. She married both of her brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, to secure her rule. These weren't happy marriages. They were purely political, and in both cases, she later removed her brothers from power. But the tradition continued because the Egyptian people expected their rulers to follow these customs, even when it led to chaos and betrayal. However, there was a dark side to all of this. Generations of inbreeding led to physical deformities, genetic disorders, and weak rulers. Many of Egypt's later pharaohs suffered from severe health problems, including infertility, weakened immune systems, and skeletal deformities. Some were unable to rule effectively because of their disabilities, which led to instability in the kingdom. Despite these risks, the practice of royal incest continued for over 2,000 years. It was deeply ingrained in Egyptian culture, and no one dared to question it. To them, the idea of a pharaoh marrying a commoner was far more scandalous than a brother and sister wedding. But as strange as this practice was, it wasn't even the most disturbing thing the Egyptian royals did. Some pharaohs didn't just want luxury and riches in the afterlife. They wanted their servants to come with them. And that led to one of the most chilling customs in Egyptian history: burying servants alive with a pharaoh. Ancient Egyptians believed that death was just the beginning of another life. To them, the afterlife was a mirror image of the real world, where the dead continued to eat, drink, and rule, just as they had in life. But here's the disturbing part. Some pharaohs didn't want to enter the afterlife alone. They wanted their servants to follow them, even in death. In the earliest dynasties, this belief led to a horrifying practice: human sacrifice for the sake of the pharaoh's afterlife. When a ruler died, dozens or even hundreds of his closest servants, bodyguards, and even pets were killed and buried alongside him. These weren't criminals or enemies. These were loyal followers who had served the pharaoh in life, only to be sent to their deaths to serve him in the next world. One of the most extreme examples of this was found in the tomb of King Jer, a pharaoh of the first dynasty. Archaeologists discovered that over 300 people had been buried around him. These were likely his servants, squat wives, and palace workers who were sacrificed to accompany him into eternity. Some of them were strangled, while others appeared to have been drugged before their burial. Their graves were arranged carefully around the king's tomb, almost as if they were still standing in formation, ready to serve him. The idea behind this practice was simple. Pharaohs believed that just as they needed servants in life, they would also need them in the afterlife. By taking their attendants with them, they ensured that their needs would be met forever. In some cases, even royal pets, including dogs and baboons, were sacrificed and buried alongside their owners. Funerals in ancient Egypt were not quiet, somber events. They were loud, dramatic, and filled with rituals meant to guide the dead into the afterlife. But here's the strange part. Many of the mourners at these funerals weren't actually grieving. They were hired professionals, paid to cry, wail, and even pull at their hair to make the funeral look more emotional. These women, known as the kites of Nephthys, were essential to Egyptian funerals. They weren't just random people putting on a show. This was a deeply respected profession. Their job was to publicly display grief on behalf of the deceased's family. The louder and more dramatic the mourning, the more important the person being buried was seen to be. A proper funeral had to follow strict traditions, and one of the most important parts was the ritual of lamentation. The professional mourners would stand near the tomb, dressed in torn clothes with dust on their heads to symbolize grief. They would cry loudly, scream the name of the deceased, and sometimes even scratch their own faces and beat their chests to show intense sorrow. One of the most famous depictions of this can be found in the tomb of Ramses, a high-ranking official during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. In the artwork, professional mourners are shown with their arms raised, their mouths open wide in grief, and their bodies bent forward in anguish. This visual display of sadness was meant to prove that the deceased was loved and honored. But these women weren't just there to cry. They also played a key role in the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was a ritual where a priest would symbolically open the mouth of the dead, using a special tool. The Egyptians believed that this act allowed the deceased to eat, drink, and breathe again in the afterlife.